Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for August the 14th, 2021. I hope you're doing well on this day. So our text for today, we've got 1 Samuel 4, marching through 1 Samuel. We've got Romans 4, which again we've talked about before earlier in the year. Jeremiah 42, and then Psalm 18. So when we start with, we'll start with 1 Samuel, since I got my text open to it right now. So this section in Samuel comes at a kind of a transition, a kind of a pause in the narrative of Samuel, which he had been the focus really of the first three chapters, and now it's showing a narrative that really focuses in on the Ark of the Covenant. Significant, obviously, because of its role in the faith of Israel. At the time, the Israelites are warring against the Philistines. And the Ark of the Covenant was symbolic of God being with his people. And so they take the Ark into the battle. Both of Eli's sons go, Hophni and Phinehas. They end up dying in the battle, and the Philistines end up taking the Ark. And ultimately, when Eli hears of this, he falls over and dies as well. So all the priesthood is now dying out, and the ark has been taken captive. So as the widow of Phinehas proclaims through naming her son, Ichabod, the glory has indeed departed, right? This shows kind of at a low point in the period of the Judges. And it's always these low points in Scripture where God comes in and does something pretty phenomenal, which is he's about to do in coming chapters, with, of course, the calling of King David. So this is a text that kind of brings us to that low point. The glory will depart, but ultimately, when we get to the construction of the temple, the glory will return, right? When God's glory comes down into the temple to dwell there with his people. And of course, the glory will return permanently in the person of Jesus Christ when he comes to the temple in the Gospels. So that's 1 Samuel 4. Let's see, we'll go to Jeremiah 42. So this is kind of continuing the story of what happens in the aftermath of the exile, and specifically what happens after Gedaliah is assassinated, which is what happened in chapter 41. And of course, in this chapter, in 42, the people are wanting to go down to Egypt because they are trying to escape the wrath of the Babylonians, who they expect will come in and punish folks for having Gedaliah murdered, he was the governor that they had installed. The Babylonians installed over the Jewish people after they had taken the rest of the people into exile. But Jeremiah doesn't want to go; he wants to stay. And some of the refugees from Mitzpah, where they were at the time, asked Jeremiah to seek Yahweh's will, the Lord's will, regarding whether they should stay or go. And they insist that they're going to abide by whatever Jeremiah says, whatever report he brings back from Yahweh. Well, Jeremiah says, we're going to stay, but the people seem very determined to go, regardless of what God has said. In fact, Jeremiah warns over and over again in this text that if you go, you're going to experience what he calls, and if you turn over there, let me turn over there, several times he talks about the sword, famine, and pestilence. Now, you probably have seen those before, and I've talked about them before. These are directly out of Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 32, Deuteronomy 28. And these are the covenant curses. And so, yes, Israel has experienced the ultimate covenant curse in the exile already, but this remnant of the Jewish people that still remain in Israel at the time, they could experience those covenant curses as well. In other words, to remain or to go to Egypt, to desert the promised land for these people would be equivalent to Jeremiah saying to breaking the covenant again. Those are always key words to pay attention to, by the way, because anytime Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Amos or any of the other prophets mention, Joel does it as well, mention these covenant curses, it's a sign and symbol that whatever the person is doing is breaking the covenant of God. And when those those things, same things are removed, those covenant curses are removed, it's a sign that God's restoring his people to that covenant relationship. Jeremiah 42. Let's go over to Psalm, and we'll close out with Romans 4. Psalm 18, one of the longer Psalms. It's a royal Psalm. It actually has a fairly extended historical notation here. And we've actually seen this in the Summer of Psalms sermon series, how these historical notations, though they are not original to the text, do reflect a long tradition, though we don't necessarily place them in the same, they're not in Scripture in the sense of being part of the scriptural text, although the Hebrew Bible considers them part of the text. Our English Bibles do not. They don't rise to the level of inerrancy, but they do reflect a long tradition of what the historical circumstance might have been like, or might have been to produce this psalm in the first place. And this seems fairly plausible. This was the Psalm of David, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of the enemies, of all his enemies, and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I love you, Lord, my strength. Now, by the way, that so I mean, this is kind of common. David facing enemies, and that produces whatever the psalm, the words of the psalm. So similar to many other psalms in the book of Psalms in that way. But he begins by expressing his love for God and for the strength that God provides. Now, that phrase love here, that verb love here, is not the same verb that's used in other places to love, the covenantal love, that in no place in the Old Testament is a person said to love God, or it says that they love God in that way. That's the Hebrew verb ahav. This is a different Hebrew verb, but it still expresses an affection for God, for what he has done for him as the king. And of course, this is through the lens of the king, that the king has received a great deliverance, verse 50. And God has shown his loving kindness, his chesed, his covenant faithfulness to his anointed, to his Moshiach. And of course, in a way, this is not just expressing God's commitment to David, although it does that, but it's also reflecting of God's promise in 2 Samuel 7, where we have that the Davidic covenant, the promise that God gives to David, that not only will he have an eternal dynasty, but another thing he says in 2 Samuel 7 is that I will not remove my loving kindness from you. It will always be extended towards you. And of course, when Jesus comes, he comes as one who is a Davidic king, who is filled with grace and truth, or filled with loving kindness and truth. The very covenantal qualities that were given and extended to David, and that David and his descendants should have exhibited, but they didn't. And therefore, we look forward to a king who would. Psalm 18. That brings us finally to Romans 4. So Romans 4 is moving to a new stage, kind of in the argument that really began with verse 21 of Romans 3, where Paul is talking about justification by faith. And here's where Paul is giving some evidence from the Old Testament of justification by faith. And specifically, he points to Abraham. Now, remember, the Jews at the time that Paul was dealing with, some of the what we would call the Judaizers, those who were claiming that you needed to be saved by being circumcised first. Well, here's Paul pointing to Abraham, the first circumcised in a covenant relationship with God, the kind of the father of circumcision for the Jewish people, right? The father of the Jewish people themselves. Here is Abraham, who is exhibit A for Paul of justification by faith. Why? Well, he points to Genesis 15:6, where in Genesis 15:6, Abraham believes God and is credited. This is credited to him as righteousness. So his righteousness, his right standing before God in covenant relationship, is through the means of his belief, not through circumcision. Why? Because circumcision didn't happen and wasn't commanded by God until Genesis 17. So this is a great, I think, example by Paul to show us the true nature of salvation. It is through faith. And our justification is not something that is earned through our actions, although actions are produced after we are justified. We are sanctified initially at salvation and grow in our holiness after that. But it is a justification that ultimately is not earned, but is through grace and faith in Jesus. So that's our text for today. Hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, August 14th, 2021.